All right, welcome back to the second part of our classical conditioning lecture. And we finished up the last video with this one example here, talking about the unconditioned stimulus, which would be the injection of drugs, the unconditioned response, which would be an increased heart rate when you are injected with those drugs, the conditioned stimulus, that is learned to be associated with the drugs, is the examination room, and the conditioned response is an increased heart rate when we are exposed to the conditioned stimulus, which is the examination room. So an increased heart rate when you enter the exam room. So we have an unconditioned stimulus. This is not something we have to learn. Our heart rate increases when we are exposed to the unconditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned response happens when we are exposed to the unconditioned stimulus. And then we learn that a conditioned stimulus usually occurs with an unconditioned stimulus. A CS usually occurs with a US. So what happens? We have the same response to the US that we have to the CS. We have the conditioned response, which is an increased heart rate when entering the exam room. All right, one more example. I have this video linked on the Canvas page. Please take a minute to watch it. It's really short. It's literally about a minute long. Go ahead and pause this video while you watch that YouTube video. All right, hopefully you watched that video. I hope you found it a little humorous. Maybe you have a similar roommate who has done things similar to you. All right, let's talk about the US, UR, CS, and CR. So the unconditioned stimulus, that's going to be getting hit with a pellet. When you're hit by a pellet, you don't have to learn that that is painful. So your unconditioned response, your reflex, is flinching in pain, flinching when you're hit by that pellet. All right, so that's the part we don't have to learn. That's the reflex part. What is the part that we have to learn? The conditioned stimulus, the thing that is being paired with getting hit by a pellet, is that sound effect. That was easy. So the conditioned response is flinching whenever we hear "that was easy" from the "that was easy" button. So, quick little recap here. Our unconditioned stimulus is getting hit by the pellet. Our reflex, our unconditioned response, is flinching when we're hit by the pellet. And our conditioned stimulus, the thing that we learn to associate with the unconditioned stimulus, is the "that was easy" sound effect. And our conditioned response is flinching every time we hear "that was easy." All right, hopefully this is making a little more sense after these examples here. Now let's talk about a few more topics in the classical conditioning unit. So, higher order conditioning. This is basically adding one more level of learning to a classical conditioning situation. So normally in classical conditioning, we have a neutral stimulus and it gets associated with a conditioned stimulus. That conditioned stimulus then let me rephrase this. So a neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. Remember, a neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not elicit a response, but it's paired with an unconditioned stimulus and it eventually becomes a conditioned stimulus. So in higher order conditioning, we pair a conditioned stimulus with a higher order conditioned stimulus, which is just another neutral stimulus that has learned to be associated with a conditioned stimulus. So we've got three stimuli going on here. We've got the unconditioned stimulus, which is learned to be associated with a conditioned stimulus. And now we've got our third higher order conditioned stimulus, which is learned to be paired with a conditioned stimulus. And just a little bit of terminology here. a higher order conditioned stimulus is going to elicit a higher order conditioned response. So what does that look like in an example here? Let's go back to Pavlov. So Pavlov has trained his dogs to drool when there's a bell rung, all right? He then pairs the presentation of a light with the sound of the bell over several different trials. So flashes a light, rings a bell, flashes a light, rings a bell, flashes a light, rings a bell. Eventually, the dogs drool whenever the light is presented, whenever they're flashed that light. So let's break this down. What's going on here? Well, the unconditioned stimulus is the food. Again, the dogs will drool anytime the food is presented. That's the unconditioned response. The dogs did not have to learn this behavior, but they did have to learn that the bell is associated with food. Every time that bell started to ring, they knew food was about to come. So what did they do? They had a conditioned response. They started to drool whenever that bell was rung. So they've learned that the bell is associated with food. Now they're going to learn that the bell is associated with the flash of a light. So this light is paired with the presentation of the bell over several trials. And before long, the dogs learn that if the light comes, that means the bell isn't too far behind. And if the bell comes, that means food is coming pretty quickly after the bell. So they're learning this three-way interaction here. They're learning that light means bell and bell means food. So before long, they have a higher order conditioned stimulus, which is the light, and pretty quickly they have a higher order conditioned response, which is drooling in the presence of the light. All right. The next term that I want to cover here is extinction. This is one of those rare times when a term just kind of makes sense. Extinction is the loss of a conditioned response. So going back to Pavlov, we can use another example here. Let's say Pavlov has conditioned his dogs to drool whenever a bell is rung. Now let's say he wants to extinguish that behavior. So what he can do is simply ring that bell and not present food. Ring the bell, not present food. Ring the bell, not present food, and do that over several trials. And before long, the dogs will stop drooling in the presence of the bell. This is what we call extinction. And for a long time, this was thought to be unlearning. They were unlearning a learned association. But this is not quite the case. What the dogs are doing is they are learning a new association. They are learning that the bell is now paired with nothing. The bell is paired with a lack of a stimulus. So that's extinction. And that pairs nicely with our next term, which is spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery occurs when you have successfully extinguished a conditioned response. So just like in our last example, Pavlov rings the bell, doesn't present food, rings the bell, doesn't present food. Before long, the dogs are not drooling to the bell. But then go ahead and just take a break. Don't present the bell for a couple days. And then you come back those couple days later, you ring the bell, lo and behold, the dogs have a conditioned response. The dogs drool in the presence of that bell. This is what we call spontaneous recovery. And this is kind of what it looks like in graphical form. So on the x-axis here, we've got time. On the y-axis, we've got the strength of a conditioned response. Strong at the top, weak at the bottom. So in the initial learning phase, which we call acquisition, the dogs are learning to associate the conditioned stimulus of the bell with the unconditioned stimulus of the food. And pretty quickly, the dogs learn the association. They have a very strong conditioned response very early on. And then let's say you want to extinguish the behavior. So you present the bell over and over and over again without the presence of food. So pretty quickly, they learn a new association. That is, the bell is now paired with nothing. And lo and behold, the conditioned response drops off pretty dramatically. Then you have this brief pause, let's say a couple days, maybe a couple hours. Excuse me. And then you come back and present that bell, you ring that bell, and lo and behold, they start to drool again. So that is what spontaneous recovery looks like. All right, a couple more terms. Generalization, another great example in psychology where the term is just so aptly named. So generalization occurs when an organism has a conditioned response to a stimulus that is similar to the conditioned stimulus. So going back to the Pavlov example, let's say instead of ringing a bell, he played a tone, maybe a piano key or something for the dogs to see if they would drool. And lo and behold, surprise, surprise, they drooled a little bit in the presence of that piano key. So that piano key sound is not the same as the bell. It's similar though, and it's similar enough that the dogs still drool a little bit. So they still have a conditioned response in the presence of that stimulus that is somewhat similar to the conditioned stimulus. So that's generalization. And this actually has some real world applications. And you can see this in some case studies. So an example of this would be PTSD. So there's some situations where soldiers will come back from combat scenarios and they will experience PTSD symptoms anytime they're exposed to loud noises. A good example of this would be fireworks. Perhaps you know someone like this who has been in a combat scenario, and as a result, they're a little skittish around fireworks. This is an example of generalization. So in that combat environment, the soldier learned that loud noises mean, potentially life-threatening situations. So then when you are removed from the battlefield and you come back home and you hear very loud noises in the form of fireworks, your body kind of goes back to that combat scenario. Your body sort of goes back to that situation where loud noises meant very bad things, even though fireworks typically don't mean bad things. Little Albert was another example. John Watson went on to show that little Albert was actually afraid of anything that resembled a bunny. So, like stuffed animals that looked like bunnies, even like fluffy pillows that were kind of bunny shaped. So, that's another example of generalization. So, one of the ways that PTSD can be treated is through what's called exposure therapy. And exposure therapy is this idea that you introduce the stimulus, the thing that someone is afraid of, and you do it in very small amounts. But those small amounts get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the person eventually learns not to be afraid of the thing they were afraid of. So, in the case of PTSD, this could be increasingly loud noises. So this is actually a pretty astounding type of therapy. It has some pretty impressive results in a relatively short period of time, like literally in one session. You can bring in people, not everyone responds to it in the same way, but you can bring in people into the laboratory and start playing them, noises that are loud and get increasingly louder. And they might not be very afraid at the end of these types of therapy sessions at all. Another example here would be people who have phobias, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more later on in the course when we get to our abnormal psych area. But they'll do the same thing with people who have phobias of, let's say, spiders, like this picture on the screen here. And what they'll do is they'll have like a tarantula in a cage on the other side of the room, like 20 feet away from the person. And the person will be a little nervous because, they're very, very afraid of spiders. And throughout the course of this therapy session, which may last several hours, they get closer and closer to that cage. Maybe they take one step forward, heart rate increases like crazy, and then they have to stand there for a little bit and calm themselves down. Once they're calmed down, they take another step forward, and their heart rate goes crazy, and they get really anxious, and they have to calm themselves down again. And before long, they're all the way across the room. They're just a foot or two from that cage. And then you take it a step further. You open up the top of the cage. And obviously that elicits a response, heart rate spikes, and then they have to take a few minutes to calm down. And then you take it a step further. You actually take the spider out of the cage. And you kind of keep doing these little baby steps. And before long, the person who's going through this therapy session, they might be holding a spider just like in this image here. There's some wonderful videos online of people coming into these therapy sessions with just debilitating phobias of certain things like snakes or spiders, and coming out of these therapy sessions literally holding the thing that they were afraid of, like in this image here. All right, so in this idea of exposure therapy, what you're doing is you're relearning an association. You're relearning to associate that object of your phobia with a new conditioned response, which could be not freaking out, essentially. Okay, so that's generalization. And then, sort of the opposite of generalization is discrimination. And discrimination is learning to differentiate or discriminate between a conditioned stimulus, a learned stimulus, and an irrelevant stimulus. So, an example here, we can go back to Pavlov, and Pavlov might have played two different types of piano keys. So maybe one with a very high pitch or maybe one with a very low pitch. And what Pavlov would do is play that very low sounding, low tone, and that is the one that was paired with food. And the dogs would learn that association. Low tone equals food. So pretty soon they're drooling in the presence of that low tone. Then he might come back and play a piano key on the opposite end of the piano, a very high-pitched piano key. And lo and behold, the dogs won't drool to that piano key. It's not similar enough to that low tone to elicit a drooling response. An example from my own life, I used to have a bright blue pair of running shoes, actually pictured on the right side of the screen there. And a dog that I had several years ago loved to run with me. It was a Rhodesian Ridgeback. And boy, he could run probably 30 miles a day if I let him. I was a pretty avid runner at the time, and oh man, we ran so many miles together. But that dog knew when I was going for a run because I would grab my blue running shoes. And I could grab any other shoes from the closet, and that dog would not get as excited. But if I grabbed those blue running shoes, it was on. Man, Larry was the dog's name, and Larry loved to run, and he knew he was going to go for a big run whenever I grabbed those blue running shoes. So this is an example of discrimination. My dog Larry could tell the difference between those blue running shoes and all the other shoes that I had in the closet there. So that is discrimination and generalization. Now let's talk about some more miscellaneous factors that affect classical conditioning. Time is a pretty big factor, specifically the time between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. So the time between the presentation of these two stimuli, the shorter that time is, then the better learning is going to occur. The faster learning will occur. If Pavlov rang the bell and then waited 10 minutes before he presented the food, the dogs aren't going to learn that association very quickly. But if he rings the bell and then immediately presents food, they're going to learn that association very easily, very quickly. So time refers to time between the presentation of the US and the CS. Similarity: the more similar the US and CS are, the better, the faster that learning will occur. So if the unconditioned stimulus is something that's painful and the conditioned stimulus is something that's maybe just less painful, that would be a great way for learning to occur. So the more similar they are. The strength of the unconditioned stimulus. So there are things that cause involuntary behavior in us and other organisms. And some of those involuntary behaviors are stronger than others. We might have a very powerful flinch if we're shot with a airsoft gun or something like that. But we might have just a slight little uncomfortable sort of adjustment if we're not hit with a very hard airsoft pellet or something like that. So the strength of the unconditioned stimulus, how much pain it causes us or how much pleasure it causes us. And the number of trials. So this would be how many times the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are paired before learning occurs. The more trials that occur, the more learning that's going to occur. All right. So I have a short video that I'd like you to watch. This shows the importance of the cerebellum and classical conditioning. If you remember, the cerebellum is a structure in the brainstem, which is a really old part of the brain. And the cerebellum seems to be where classical conditioning is housed, where it it has a biological basis. So we'll talk about this. Go ahead and watch that video. Pause this video. All right, so what are the US, UR, CS, and CR from that video? So in that video, you saw a rabbit learn to blink in the presence of that tone or that light, because that meant that a little puff of air was about to strike its eye. So the unconditioned stimulus would be the puff of air. The unconditioned response would be blinking. The conditioned stimulus would be the tone or that flash of light. And the conditioned response would be blinking in the presence of that flash or that tone. So the little critters, the rabbits there, they learned this association. They learned that a puff of air was about to come if they were shown that light or that tone. And then they had their cerebellums lesioned. And then lo and behold, they no longer had that association. So kind of some follow-up thoughts about classical conditioning. There's some good evidence that this is probably the oldest form of learning on the planet. And this is actually a form of learning that most critters on this planet, most living things have, certainly in the animal kingdom. So earthworms, roundworms, which are invertebrates, have classical conditioning abilities. They can learn to associate two stimuli. Caterpillars can be taught a classical conditioning trial. They can be taught to associate a CS with a US. They can then go through the metamorphosis inside a chrysalis and turn into butterflies. And those butterflies can show that same level of learning back when they were caterpillars. So think about that. When a caterpillar is inside of its chrysalis, it's just like goo, basically. But somehow it comes out on the other side as butterflies and still has that learning locked away somewhere in its brain. So these classical conditioning principles are incredibly simple if they can somehow survive that transformation. So it was about 450 million years ago that we shared an evolutionary ancestor with invertebrates. So the fact that invertebrates like earthworms and roundworms have classical conditioning, and we as humans also have classical conditioning, suggests that classical conditioning was on the planet at least 450 million years ago. back when we shared a common ancestor with invertebrates. Now, does that extend to plants? The jury's still out on this. So we have some okay evidence that plants exhibit classical conditioning learning. We have some okay evidence that algae exhibits classical conditioning learning, but it's not very convincing yet. It's not in any way proven on a scientific level. And you have to go all the way back to 600 million years ago before we shared a common evolutionary ancestor with plants. So we have some pretty good evidence that classical conditioning was on the planet 450 million years ago, but going back to 600 million years ago, I don't know. Jury's still out yet. All right, so classical conditioning, how can we use it for real world applications? Well, we already talked about exposure therapy. We'll talk about that quite a bit more when we get to the clinical psych unit. But aversion therapy is another form of therapy that uses classical conditioning principles. So in aversion therapy, you are taught to associate whatever drug it is that you're addicted to. You're learned to associate that drug with feelings of nausea, vomiting. So this term here, emetic drug, this is a type of drug that induces vomiting. So you're given this drug, and that's your unconditioned stimulus. They abbreviated it UCS. Unconditioned stimulus is the emetic drug. The unconditioned response is vomiting. That is a universally unpleasant experience. So then through several trials, you pair the presentation of alcohol with the ingestion of this emetic drug. So alcohol is given to the person, and at the same time, they are given this vomiting drug. Lo and behold, vomiting occurs. So before long, you learn to associate alcohol with the very unpleasant experience of vomiting. So before long, alcohol becomes a conditioned stimulus and vomiting becomes a conditioned response. You start to realize that anytime alcohol is around, there's a good chance that you're going to be vomiting because of that association between the emetic drug and alcohol. Now, this is something we actually do to ourselves quite frequently. Those of you who have ever had a night of excessive drinking and woken up the next day and the mere thought of alcohol is a little nauseating, that is aversion therapy on a small scale. Unfortunately, it doesn't really last that long. Usually a couple days passes and we find ourselves thinking, I could really go for a beer right now. Might go partying on the town again. We just don't learn our lesson. There's also some evidence, and I threw this in there, I just thought this was so interesting. There's some evidence here that aversion therapy can be used while we are asleep. So in this particular study, the researchers looked at olfactory aversion. So this would be a very bad smell. And what they did is they trained cigarette smokers to associate the smell of cigarettes with a very powerful, awful smell. Think like a skunk or something like that. So they presented cigarette smoke to these people while they were sleeping, and they paired it with a very bad smell. And what they found is that when these people woke up, they had a little bit of an aversion to cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke smelled really bad because they had learned to associate cigarette smoke with that really bad smelling, offensive smell. I just thought that was so cool. All right, so I'm just going to finish up this lecture with sort of a mixed grab bag of other forms of learning. So operant conditioning, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the next lecture. But we're going to finish up with insight learning, latent learning, and observational learning. All right, so insight learning. Insight learning is that kind of light bulb, aha, eureka type moment. And this is usually involved with complex problem solving. This is that sudden realization, and there's no trial or error. That's an important component of this insight learning. You're not slowly approaching a solution to the problem. You're not, trying to get it failing, trying to get it failing, and getting a little bit closer each time. That's not what this is. That's trial and error. And this is that sudden realization, the sudden solving of a particular problem. There's been a lot of research into insight learning done with chimpanzees. And there was a famous German psychologist by the name of Kohler. He was actually fleeing the country of Germany during World War I, and he just couldn't leave his beloved chimpanzees behind. He actually fled to America and continued his experiments on insight learning with his chimpanzees that he saved from World War I there. Go ahead and watch that video. It's a really silly little video of a chimpanzee figuring out a complex problem. Um, I won't spoil the video, so go ahead and watch it. Latent learning is the next form of learning I want to talk about. Latent learning occurs when behavior is sort of unstructured. There's no reward system in place to reward particular behavior. So behavior is kind of just free form. And then all of a sudden, at some point in these experiments, a form of motivation is presented. A reward is presented for successfully completing a particular type of behavior. And what we find in these experiments is that learning was occurring before that reward was present. So let's take a look at this graph here. This is going to explain it a little bit better. On the y-axis, we have average errors multiplied by 3. So the y-axis is just the number of mistakes made. And the x-axis is going to be days. So this is how many days the trial or the experiment had proceeded. And this is actually the number of mistakes that rats were making in a maze experiment. And we've got 3 different groups here. We've got the blue line, which represents the groups of rats that were never reinforced for finishing the maze. So they were just allowed to wander around the maze, and there was no little block of cheese at the end of the maze. So they never really learned a whole lot. They didn't really learn how to navigate the maze. The blue line is more or less flat. And then let's jump to the green line. The green line represents the group that was always reinforced. So this group constantly had motivation present to complete the maze. There was always that chunk of cheese at the end of the maze. And you can see the blue line actually decreases in errors fairly steadily. It's constantly going downward. The rats are making less and less errors every day to get to that brick of cheese. And then we have the interesting group here, the red line group. This group was reinforced after a 10-day period. So before they were reinforced, so days 1 through 10, they were allowed to just wander around the maze. There's no brick of cheese at the end of it. But then day 10 comes around and there is a brick of cheese. And then we see this very dramatic drop in the number of errors that those rats were making. So in days 1 through 10, they were kind of just learning about the layout of the maze. And that's what we call latent learning. They didn't have any particular motivation to learn the plan of the maze, but all of a sudden, when there's a chunk of cheese, when there's a motivation to successfully navigate the maze, we find that they actually were learning in days 1 through 10. And that's what we call latent learning. There wasn't any obvious learning going on, but once there's some sort of reward available, we see that, okay, there was learning going on. It just wasn't obvious. That's latent learning, and that was put forth by a guy named Edward Tolman. A great example of latent learning in real life is what we might call flopping. Flopping is something that occurs in sports when a player pretends to be injured. They're flopping on the ground like, oh my gosh, I'm grievously injured here, when in reality, they're just trying to exaggerate what really happened. This happens in soccer a lot, not to disparage that sport by any means, but it's definitely something that's almost like a strategy at this point in the game. Here on the screen here, I'm sure you're seeing Mike Smith, that's the goalie in the red and white pants. That's definitely a flop there. The guy in the red and blue uniform on Montreal did give him a little bit of a tap there, but I think Mike Smith is exaggerating just how dramatic that impact was. So this is definitely a flop here. So some examples of latent learning. This is when you might find yourself saying, I didn't know I had it in me. An example I give of this is I had a buddy named Adam, just never really went fishing in his whole life. But all of a sudden, we found ourselves up in the Boundary Waters, which is a wilderness area in northern Minnesota. And it's just a series of interconnected lakes and rivers. And you can usually traverse them via canoe. And so Adam has never fished before. And lo and behold, we're getting a little bit low on fresh fruits and veggies, and our meals are getting a little bland. And so we go out fishing. And my buddy Adam is by far the best fisherman in our group. I mean, this guy caught probably like 12 different bass. And so we're eating like kings that night. And the whole time we're just talking about how we had no idea that Adam was such a great fisherman. And he himself did not know. He didn't know he was such a good fisherman because, again, he never really had the motivation to fish. But when you're really hungry and you're in a wilderness setting and fresh fish starts to sound pretty tasty, well, looks like there was some learning that occurred at some point in Adam's life. So this really brings up this greater issue of what's your motivation for engaging in a particular behavior? Because your motivation is going to have a huge influence on your overall performance of that behavior. All right, lastly, I want to finish up, excuse me, with observational learning. This is going to be our last form of learning in this lecture. Learning is not simply a personal experience. It's not something that happens in a social vacuum. It's not something that happens in complete social isolation. We actually learn through social observation quite a bit. So we have to talk about a guy named Bandura. And Bandura was big on this idea of social learning, observational learning. Now, before Bandura came along, there was this idea that catharsis was a good way to get rid of aggressive urges, which means catharsis, the basic idea here is that if you have a really strong urge to do something, if you engage in that strong urge, it'll sort of purge you of that urge in the future. So if you have very aggressive urges, if you're feeling very aggressive, the general thinking here is to act on them. Maybe join a boxing match or go wrestling or something like that. And afterwards, you'll be much calmer. The general research consensus is that's not the case. And up until Bandura, it was thought that you could simply watch violent sports, contact sports like maybe football or boxing. Simply watching those sports would kind of purge you of those aggressive urges. But it took Bandura and his very famous Bobo doll experiments to kind of rewrite the story there on catharsis. So go ahead and watch that video. That is definitely one of the most famous experiments in all of psychology. And the basic summary here is that little children learn to act pretty aggressively towards a blow up inflatable clown doll simply by watching their older adults in a social situation. And this is definitely an important way that we learn. Bandura kind of hit the nail on the head here. We don't learn things in social isolation. We learn by watching others. That's a big way that we learn. And this is actually the foundational roots of culture. So think about how we dress, how we socially interact with peers, how we socially interact with supervisors or people at different social levels. Those are all lessons learned through social interaction. How we gain resources, how we get a job, how we procure money, how we get a mate, how we get a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a husband or a wife. Those are all skills that we learn through social interaction. Our parents, our friends, our peers, our teachers, they teach us how to do those things. And the last bit I want to talk about here is mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are a relatively recent discovery in psychology. And what these mirror neurons show is that there, in some cases, is no difference between watching a behavior and performing that behavior ourselves. We're going to talk a lot more about mirror neurons when we get to the social psychology section. But for now, I just want you to know they exist. And this is one of the reasons why we have athletes watch a lot of video. If we have any athletes in this course, I bet they might be the first to tell you that they spend a lot of time in the video room. After a game, or maybe even after a practice, you might spend a lot of time with a video coach going over the video from that game or that practice. But I also just want to finally mention here that mirror neurons are also thought to be the basis of empathy. So, like I said earlier, mirror neurons allow us to have the same experience whether we are performing a behavior ourselves or observing someone else experience that behavior, perform that behavior. So you can imagine if you see someone experience something very painful, that kind of makes you cringe yourself. If you've ever seen someone maybe get checked or tackled really hard in football or hockey, you might cringe a little bit. That's your mirror neurons firing. In some small way, you are also experiencing the pain of that really hard tackle or that really hard check. So that, for some psychologists, is the root, or at least the biological root of empathy. We feel other people's pain. And for a very real reason, we want to avoid causing other people pain. All right, that is all I have for you guys on part 1 of learning. Stay tuned for part 2, where we go over operational or operant conditions.